Okay, okay. So, okay, folks, I've been given the thumbs up, which means we're kind of ready to rock and roll. So if you all can find your seats, I know grab something else in the foyer if you want to drink, but then hop on in and get our seats for our lecture today. I want to also mention that Dr. Vesley-Flad has her books with her, so following the lecture and the Q&A, you'll want to make sure that you have an opportunity to meet her, speak with her, and purchase a book, right? Nancy?
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everyone. So good to see these bright, shining faces on this bright, shining, glorious morning. To commemorate Juneteenth weekend this year, we have a unique opportunity to hear from, in our Faith and Community Forum here, to hear from Dr. Rima Vesley-Flad, who has published her third book, The Fire Inside, the Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. We welcome you very much, Dr. Rima Vesley-Flad. When Rima was 28, and I'm going to let her tell a whole lot more of her story here in a minute, she found herself as a cerebral, well-educated, and yet struggling black woman, fiercely independent. She looked around at the many injustices and adversities she had lived through, both personally and collectively in American life. Over time, she came to the realization that she was intellectually accomplished, well regarded as a social activist, and also searching for some deeper connection. She has earned, she turned to Buddhism, which I love and adore this part, worked with mentors in this ancient tradition, found a surprising number of black people practicing and learning its tenets. Today, she works at the intersection of social activism, inner contemplation, Buddhist Dharma, and teaching these precepts to others. In Christian terms, it might be said that she had experienced a metanoia since she was 28, a complete transformation of character and reorientation towards life. She's earned multiple advanced degrees. She is the founding director of the Initiative for Black Buddhist Studies and the author of 2 other books. She has twice been awarded a Department of State Fulbright Fellowship as postgraduate student in South Africa and as a faculty member in Ghana. Dr. Vesley-Flad, we welcome you today with open hearts and open minds.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Reverend Moore and Wes, for getting us technologically connected. It's wonderful to be with you. What an amazing attendance on not only Father's Day, but also a day that there will be a parade, I'm told, to celebrate Juneteenth. So happy Juneteenth. Maybe this will be the next step in your journey today to then going to the streets and celebrating this very important recognition and holiday. I'm really happy to be with you, in part because it's taken some time, and Bruce Elliott, a member of this community, maybe some or all of you know him, has been the driving energy behind my arrival this morning. And it's interesting to hear this introduction of my transformation, and I think there's some validity in that particular very weighty term, because Bruce has great effusive energy around my own journey. And what I'll present today is much more of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde and why I have come to what we call Buddha Dharma, or the Buddhist tradition, through their lenses, even though neither ever self-identified as Buddhist and certainly never wrote about Buddhism, but where I hear their words pointing in a certain direction. And to my great surprise and pleasure, some of what I'll say this morning echoes what we heard in the sermon. So let me first give acknowledgments, and I'll just say part of why I start with these acknowledgments is that in my own experience of Buddhism in the United States, there's often erasure of the Asian and Asian American lineages or origins. So first, to point out that what I will introduce this morning comes from somewhere. 2,600 years of labor, of investment, of research, intellectual and spiritual commitment, and that comes from a certain region of the world, and it's important to say that and to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that we live on land that was populated by people indigenous to this land. It's a colonized land. Many of us, including my own ancestors, were brought here forcibly. To acknowledge the indigenous peoples who were in this land and the tremendous violence enacted upon them, even today. And then not least, and I include Baldwin and Lord in this camp, to acknowledge our ancestors. And I often say those who are known to us, those who are unknown, our spiritual ancestors, our biological ancestors, but to bring them into this space. And in our celebration of Juneteenth especially, to recognize the ancestral peoples who survived. And by that survival, someone like me could stand here and be with you today. And I want to dedicate this not only to our ancestors we celebrate through this holiday of Juneteenth, but also the people of Palestine. So struck by the reading today and Ishmael and the acknowledgement that Ishmael too was honored by God and is an ancestor of Abraham. And we can come back to that. The first chapter of my book talks a great deal about what's happening in Palestine today and more broadly, the connections that I make between Palestinians and the onslaught of Arab peoples and what has happened to people of African descent. So we can come back to that in the conversation. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll check in, and if you want to move to Q&A, we can do that, or I can keep talking. But let me first just talk to you about two parts of this book. Oh, I want to move forward. Wes, I might need some support. Thank you. Okay. So the book has 6 chapters, and of course I'm not able to talk about all of them this morning, but I want to hone in on 2 aspects that I think are particularly pertinent. One is an emphasis on suffering in the Buddhist tradition. The First Noble Truth talks about the fact of suffering, that there is suffering in life, that it's not personal, but that suffering happens. And another aspect that I think is particularly pertinent for our time is the experience of rage that is very valid, that is justified, but what it means to actually metabolize rage. And that is something that I'll point to and how this practice of Buddhism supports that transformative practices that can lead us to metabolizing rage, but also dealing in a direct way with our suffering. Okay, Wes, I think I need support. There we go. Okay, thank you. Oh, point it to you, not. Thank you. Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about both of our luminaries, James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. And just to give you a brief overview of Baldwin, I think many of you at least know his name and perhaps a little bit about his life. He was born in 1924 in Harlem, the eldest of 8 children, born into deep poverty. And this is something he talked a great deal about throughout his essays and his fiction and interviews he did. Baldwin, from a young age, loved literature and plays. He had a very curious mind. He was raised in connection to the church, and particularly his stepfather, who he called his father, a man who was very bitter, but also very committed to preaching and to being involved introduced him to a path that Baldwin at the age of 14 also began to walk. And that is something that will come up, you'll see in the next slide. He found himself disaffected from the church. He was much more drawn to writing, and upon graduation moved to Greenwich Village. He started to write reviews of books, and at the age of 24, felt that he needed a different context. And one of the burning questions Baldwin had is, what is the Black experience and what is the human condition? So he found himself with a one-way ticket to Paris with $40 in his pocket and went, and it was then he felt he began to hear the music and the words of his people. Okay. This is a quote from Baldwin's, perhaps his most famous book, The Fire Next Time. And I want to read it with you. This is actually something that is usually not done, which is putting lots of words on a screen. But this quote, in many ways, gives us a window into how Baldwin helps us to also understand the teachings of Buddhism, particularly this first noble truth about the fact of suffering. But Baldwin's also taking on what has happened to Black people in the United States. And so I want us to hear him and then come back to aspects of this. Baldwin writes, after writing about lynchings and the fact of tremendous violence and the fact that Black people could not protect their families, he says, people who cannot suffer can never grow up, can never discover who they are. That man who is forced each day to snatch his manhood, his identity, out of the fire of human cruelty that rages to destroy it, knows something about himself and human life that no school on earth, and indeed no church, can teach. He achieves his own authority, and that is unshakable. This is because in order to save his own life, he is forced to look beneath appearances, to take nothing for granted, to hear the meaning behind the words. If one is continually surviving the worst that life can bring, one eventually ceases to be controlled by a fear of what life can bring. Baldwin says, whatever it brings must be borne. And I think this is so important to unpack and to register in our bodies. People who cannot suffer can never grow up, Baldwin says, can never discover who they are. But what he's also saying is that you can learn to suffer with skill, that actually you can take it on, you can develop some capacity for suffering. I heard that in the sermon this morning of looking directly. Can we take on those aspects of us that may, for example, fill us with shame? Can we take on the forms of betrayal that have landed upon us, which is something I write about in the most personal ways. Because as a young Black child growing up in a white family, I had parents who rejected my existence, certainly my appearance, but just the fact that I had been born. So to hear Baldwin say that, people who cannot suffer can never grow up, is to also hear that in our own lives, and I can say this personally, that we can actually learn to lean into it and to use it, to find some way through it. Baldwin says if we can do this, we achieve a kind of unshakable authority, a place to land, kind of inner stability to stand on. And then he says if we are taking this on willingly, if we are facing what comes at us, that we cease to be afraid of it. And I think there's something really powerful in that. I would say in our own minds that when we take on our mental suffering, what comes at us in our outer environment is much less potent and much less overwhelming. Audre Lorde, in many ways, even though they weren't they weren't necessarily natural conversation partners, in many ways she echoes what Baldwin says. And they have similarities in their biographies, and they also have great differences. So just to tell you a little bit about Audre Lorde, and then I'll bring in her view of suffering. Just to tell you a little bit, she too was born in Harlem, but the youngest. She was the youngest of 3 sisters. She was the darkest in her family, and she writes about what that meant for her personally. She was 10 years younger than Baldwin, so they didn't necessarily move in the same world. She actually was educated in Catholic schools. Her family was a bit more middle class. Her parents were immigrants. She was first generation. Audre Lorde, though, like Baldwin, loved words. She loved poetry. She too wrote through high school. Upon graduation, she too left her home immediately. They both went out into the working world and worked factory jobs. Audre Lorde, in particular, moved in a feminist environment. She worked on creating and living in women's communities and was part of forming the second generation women's movement. She was invested in poetry. She gave birth to 2 children. In a certain way, she achieved a master's degree in library science, and in a certain way, she expanded her horizons. Baldwin left. He went to France. He lived for about 10 years in Turkey, on and off. In many ways, he left and came back, leapt and came back. And Audre Lorde stayed. She moved to Staten Island and raised a family and was deeply invested in a particular community in the United States. So there are similarities and differences, and they actually didn't get along the one time they met. But in so many ways, they mirror each other. And here we hear her words, and maybe you'll hear some of Baldwin in this. So this quote comes from an interview in 1982, and the context is that she had purchased an old home on Staten Island, and a window fell on her arm, and she was trapped. So this is what she reflects on. She says, "It was crucial, that 7 minutes. In it, I lived the whole history of pain from start to finish. The choice was immediate, to die or to bear the pain. And what does bearing mean?" She says it means changing or going through. It is not death. It is an experience encapsulated. It could stop, it could be ended. She says, but this was not possible for me. And by that she means she was physically trapped. So the pain is transformed. The intensity changes. It has to stop or it has to change. This is a physical knowledge I had not had before, that pain has a mutability. This is very, very important. And that is just as true about emotional pain. It will change or stop. I felt at that point that there was nothing I could not do, nothing that I could not deal with, because pain will always either change or stop, always. The confidence that it will change is what makes bearing possible. So pain is fluid. It is only when you conceive of it as something static that it is unbearable. This points to some of the deepest truths within the Buddhist tradition, the truth of impermanence, the fact of suffering. But you hear in Audre Lorde that it is not the end game, that there's actually a way to work with it and a way to understand it. So just to come back to this tradition called Buddhism, I mentioned to you this first noble truth, the fact of suffering. And we have over 2,600 years, many iterations, many lineages, but in each one we find this adherence, this commitment to facing suffering, to finding ways to work through suffering with skill, to learn from suffering. And we'll hear from our luminaries today over and over that all of it is useful. They're important to us because they assume this fact of suffering rather than wishing it away or saying it shouldn't happen. And by that, they are saying that it is possible to attain this unshakable authority, to refuse to be controlled by fear, a fear of what life could bring. And this is illuminated for us in an early Buddhist teaching. This is called the Salata Sutta. A sutta is like an oral transmission of a Buddhist truth or teaching. This is translated as the tale of 2 arrows. So in this story, we have a man who is shot by an arrow. which is to say an experience lands on him. It comes from out of the blue. It's deeply painful. And in that experience of pain, there are options. There is the feeling of the pain. There's also, for so many of us, a kind of mental proliferation, like a kind of spinning or a devolving into anxiety or even depression. But in this tale of two arrows, the Buddhist tradition teaches us we can work with our minds skillfully. We can watch what's happening. We can invest in simply seeing rather than spinning narratives and stories. And this is a practice. This is a skill to just feel or to just see, but not to spin, not to devolve, not to create conditions in which we inflict more suffering on ourselves. That is the heart of the practice. Can we work with this first arrow, this fact of suffering, in a way that doesn't then add to more suffering, particularly mental suffering? So here we have Audre Lorde clarifying for us this early Buddhist teaching. This is probably written in the 2nd century, but here we have Audre Lorde in the 21st century saying to us, there's a difference between pain and suffering. And what she says is, there's a distinction I'm beginning to make in my living between pain and suffering. Pain is an event, an experience that must be recognized, named, and this is important for Audre Lorde, used in some way in order for the experience to change, to be transformed into something else, strength or knowledge or action. She says suffering, on the other hand, is the nightmare of reliving unscrutinized and unmetabolized pain. When I live through pain without recognizing it self-consciously, I rob myself of the power that can come from using that pain, the power to fuel some movement beyond it. I condemn myself to reliving that pain over and over and over whenever something close triggers it. She says, and that is suffering, a seemingly inescapable cycle. And so I name for you that we have this first arrow. Audre Lorde says pain is an event, an experience, and that still we can use this in some way. We can use it to be transformed. We can use it to gain strength or more knowledge or to take action. And then I want to hone in on these words, unscrutinized and unmetabolized pain, because this practice that her words point us to is this practice of self-scrutiny. That's a term she uses a lot in her work. This practice of metabolizing. Can we actually work with it and transform it rather than having it just land on us? And then her word power. This is so Audre Lorde, power. That is the purpose, is to gain power, to have agency, to actually be able to act. Oh, did I go too far? Okay, all right. So this is deeply linked to an experience of anger. And something else that Audre Lorde talks about is the fact that we experience anger, that it's justified anger. It is anger that we feel at what's happening with immigrants in our country, what's happening with Palestine, Palestinians, Iran, right now Lebanon. It's the anger that we feel at injustice happening. It's a bell, a whistle. It's something that tells us this is wrong. And what Audre Lorde talks about is that this is valid anger, not to be repressed or wished away, not to be ignored, but rather to be trained. And she uses this term, training with accuracy. What she says, I think this is where we get this meditative practice. It is not the anger of other women that will destroy us, but our refusals to stand still, to listen to its rhythms, to learn within it, to move beyond the manner of presentation to the substance, to tap that anger as an important source of empowerment. So, to not just look at how it shows up, but to get beneath it and see what is useful or valued. What is important? What does this anger signal? Audre Lorde tells us anger is loaded with information and energy. And what's important, and this points to my title, The Fire Inside, is that it shows up in our bodies. And both she and Baldwin talk about this, a molten pond at the core of me, a boiling hot spring likely to erupt at any point. This is a fire that illuminates an aspect of life that is out of alignment, that is wrong. And yet, it's an energy that can be used to cultivate agency and dignity. It's a catalyst, she says, that can transform us and our conditions. So you hear both with suffering and with anger, there's something always useful. And she says how to train that anger with accuracy rather than deny it has been one of the major tasks of my life. I'll break here only in the interest of just telling you how I have met these words personally. Because I mentioned a little bit about my grandparents and growing up in a family in which the message from the get-go was that I should not have been born. And my mother was someone who acquiesced to her parents' worldview, even though she had chosen to have 2 children with a Black man. The fact that she exposed me to them, the fact that she went along with their dictates was very painful and also enraging. When I was in college, my grandparents, who were the descendants of Eastern European immigrants, held a 50th anniversary party. And they moved in a white world, and they were very ashamed of having Black grandchildren. And they held this anniversary party and said to my mother, "You can come with your white husband, but you can't bring your children." And she went. When I found out, I was 20 years old, in college. I had so much rage, and it followed me for years upon years. I do think that these practices helped me to meet and just stay with it, to not deny it. It was valid rage. It still makes me angry. She still is often saying deeply offensive things. And yet, there's some capacity to meet it and to not be controlled by it. And in fact, I can be here today because she's with my children. So there's some capacity also to acknowledge, to give voice to it, and to work with it in a way that doesn't allow for the relationship to simply break and stay broken. The relationship did break for many years, and I won't deny that it has been very hard to heal, and I won't deny that it's ongoing. And yet, for me, so much of this practice, this training anger with accuracy, this capacity to stay with that molten pond and to not be consumed by it and to not be controlled by a fear of confrontation, has been that work of acknowledging and finding ways to metabolize. I say this in part because I was so struck by the sermon this morning and betrayal, the fact that we don't often acknowledge how much betrayal hurts. So what do we do with all of that? That is the work of this practice I have found in my own life. And the betrayal of my mother has been one of those experiences, a first arrow. So what do we do? What is the second arrow? That is this practice, you could say, of confrontation of our own minds and emotions. I have found that at least in my own practice. What Baldwin says, much like Audre Lorde, is that if we don't look at it, then we can't change it. So I heard that as well in the sermon this morning, choosing to see clearly. I have a friend, I'll use her name because I think it's always important to cite people. She's a Dharma teacher named Leslie Booker. She's based in New York and Philadelphia. What she'll often say is, can we just hold it in the palm of our hand? Can we just look at it? No judgment, no story, just see what's there. That's this act of clear seeing. And also, validating anger is a sword that cuts through delusion. In the Buddhist tradition, there are 3 states of mind: we're told. There's the state of mind of hunger or greed, a state of mind of aversion, which involves anger or fear, a state of mind of what we call delusion or confusion. We could see anger as something that cuts through that delusion. That's the bell, the signal, the whistle. Something is wrong. Baldwin says anger arises from an examined life. So to look, to see clearly what is actually happening. And then choosing to swallow this poison of anger rather than live in deception and myopia. I'll come back to that point, choosing to swallow the poison of anger and tell you where that comes from. But for Baldwin, what's important to name is that we have choices in how we meet everything that comes at us. We have choices in how we meet that first arrow. And what he says is that drowning, or deep water and drowning, were not the same thing. He writes that line in one of his short stories, which is called Sonny's Blues. You can see this image. Sonny's Blues is a story of a young man who's a jazz musician, blues musician, who's mentored by an older man. And this older man has been through so much and says to Sonny that you can be in deep water and not drown. There's actually some way to learn to swim, that there is some capacity for training. Oh, I think I missed a slide. No. I usually have a slide of a peacock, and I'm not sure where it is. But let me tell you then where this language of swallowing the poison of anger comes from. There's a 12th century story. It's actually in a lineage of Buddhism, a turning of the wheel that's called Vajrayana, sometimes associated with the area of the world known as Tibet. Vajrayana Buddhism is quite different from other forms of Buddhism. And if we have time, actually, I can tell you a little bit more about it because my next slides go through that. But just to say, in terms of swallowing this poison, in this story, there is this emphasis on turning towards that which might be considered poison and choosing to internalize it. And the story is this. It's of a peacock roaming a beautiful garden, and there are beautiful medicinal plants, and there are poisonous stalks. And these peacocks, who are considered enlightened beings, choose to swallow the poisonous stalks rather than the medicinal plants that are available to them. But in choosing to swallow those poisonous stalks, they metabolize the poison. They work with it effectively. So rather than only choosing that which is beautiful or medicinal, this way of turning towards that which is poisonous, not only acknowledging it, but transforming it in our bodies, is a core teaching of this tradition of Buddhism called Vajrayana Buddhism. So that is what Baldwin and Lord are getting at, that there's this way of choosing, this way of turning towards, this way of metabolizing that leads us forward. To not say, I wish that didn't happen, or that should not have happened, or it shouldn't have happened to us, but rather it has happened. What do we do with it? How does it lead it forward? And most importantly, how is it useful? How does it become fuel? Let me do a quick check-in. I've gone about half an hour. I can keep going, have more slides. I'm always happy to keep introducing these writers, but let me ask, would you rather have more time for Q&A? Thoughts? I heard there were some talkers in the audience. Keep going? All right. What's that? For questions? Requests for? Oh, I can read a passage. Do you want me to read a passage from the book? Okay. Okay. I won't go through the slides, but I can certainly read from the introduction. But I did want to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. Does that sound right? Yeah? Okay. All right. As I mentioned, the first chapter is on Palestine, but I'll read from the introduction. And some of this will now be familiar to you, but you'll hear a bit more of my own story. Okay, so I started this book in Paris in October of 2024, actually right after Helene happened in Western North Carolina. James Baldwin wrote his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, sitting on the bright red faux leather seats of Café des Fleurs. Decades later, I sat on those same seats and imagined Baldwin sinking into memories of his childhood as he wrote, making sense of his early experiences as he stared at the fan-like tile pattern on the floor, the fake red and white flowers in tall, narrow vases. I could see him staring at the mirrors on the wall and seeing his own reflection, taking note of the features that had been cruelly mocked in his youth. I envisioned him remembering the man he called his father. Everyone had always said that John would be a preacher when he grew up, just like his father, Baldwin wrote. It is the first line of Baldwin's novel, which he acknowledged as autobiographical in nature. In the novel, Baldwin, through the voice of a young man named John, yearns for love, a love that he will never receive from his father. He commits to the church, but this too does not bring the love he expects. Baldwin, through his writing of John, went into his suffering, the experience of being despised by his stepfather and the white world. Then he envisioned another father, imagined, biological, both for John and for himself. This father was not a preacher. He did not even believe in God. Richard, John's father, smokes and cusses. He loves science, art, and history museums. This imagined father evokes Baldwin's own love for learning. As Baldwin himself said, it was his teacher's early recognition of his intelligence that would save him and that would help him save himself. Baldwin saved himself by turning towards his pain. He published Nobody Knows My Name in 1961. It is the title of a collection of essays about race and racism, exile and belonging. His later book, No Name in the Street, unraveled the absences that he had endured throughout his lifetime. Absence was a central theme for Audre Lorde, too. She wrote extensively about alienation from her family of origin, of experiencing her parents and sisters as distant and cold. She only found affection within her family in her final years with one of her half-sisters as she battled liver cancer. Her father's 3 other children had lived in the Caribbean, and she had not known of their existence until very late in life. And yet, absence did not have the last word. In 1982, Audre Lorde published Zami, a new spelling of my name. For Lorde and for Baldwin, writing became a way to turn towards absences and establish a presence in their own language, on their own terms. The experience of self-creation born of estrangement, what Audre Lorde described as the wisdom arising from living as a sister outsider, would shape her awareness of herself and her relationships with other Black women over decades. So too would Lorde's physical presence in the world. She was legally blind and did not speak until the age of 4, but she embraced these seeming disabilities as gifts that fostered her enormous vision, the capacity to see differently and to dream, to honor difference, to articulate herself through poetry. Anguish mingled with tenderness. As I sat in Café des Fleurs and later, as I stood in front of Paris's most esteemed university, the Sorbonne, I was attuned to Lourdes' fierce power, to Baldwin's unflinching capacity to see into himself and to look directly at the world around him. All you are ever told in this country about being Black is that it is a terrible, terrible thing to be, Baldwin stated in 1961. Now, in order to survive this, you have to really dig down into yourself and recreate yourself, really, according to no image which yet exists in America. You have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you, not with its idea of you. I heard Baldwin. I heard Lourdes say the same thing in her own way time and again. They were unshakable, protective. I was increasingly aware of what it had taken for them to attain such strength. Like them, I had come up against a rigid conservative theology in my home, and I too had been hated by members of my family, which you now know about. I had been abandoned by my father and completely cut off from his lineage. And for nearly 5 decades, I did not know my paternal grandmother's name. I knew what absence meant. Yet through books, I had learned to imagine something else, another way of being, another world to live in. I resonated with Baldwin and Lourdes' love for words. I too was a lover of ideas, theories, language, of literature and poetry. I too was determined to recreate myself. So I'll stop there, just in the interest of time. Thank you for that. I wasn't expecting to read from the book, but I appreciate that request.
Thank you, Rima. This has been filling. All right, questions? You might have some answers, but we'll leave that to her for now. So, be ready. Be the first one to hold your hand up. We bring your mic to you so that we can keep it alive and recording.
Good morning. First, I just want to say thank you. And my question is regarding your relationship with your mother. How were you able to kind of get past that suffering and journey towards healing?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't usually talk about that when I'm giving talks. And this is at least my 20th talk on this book tour. That's interesting that I felt very compelled to just say that this morning. And I'll tell you a story that I didn't write in the book, but it does point to this capacity to just stay with that level of suffering, the betrayal, how much anger I felt. Really, not just shame, but like a sense that there was something deeply immoral about like acquiescing to my grandparents' racism. So it was hard to have respect. And in my second year of meditation, so I have been sitting for over 20 years, since 2004, December of 2004. And in my second year, I joined a Zen community. I was never formally a student, but I would go every Sunday morning. I would go for these 10-hour sits, which the language, the Japanese term is zazenkai. I think it means 10 in some way, shape, or form, but anyway, we sat for 10 hours. It was a really long day. I remember 8 to 6, just mostly in stillness, a little bit of walking. It was really hard on the body. And I remember being really aware of physical pain. And over time, because I would do this maybe once a month, like the last couple of minutes of a 10-hour sit, my mind would start to settle. But I would have these it was almost like voices really loudly speaking to me in my head of like how much I felt self-hatred, how much I felt hated, like whatever I felt was wrong with me. And I remember then, after a very long time, we were instructed to like count our breaths or what have you. There are different instructions. It didn't really work for me, but the idea that I might return to my breath was really effective, and the stillness, so there was nothing else to occupy me. It was really useful, even though my body was in a lot of pain. And I remember still, it's been more than 20 years, just what it was like to not have those voices. There was just some edge of silence, and it was so healing and so compelling. It was such hard work. There's another teacher, his name is Larry Rosenberg, and he'll say in his writing, like, silence isn't something you can chase after. It doesn't come if you pursue it. You can't work hard to get it. You have to actually invite it, and you have to just let it come. You can't work. And I'm a worker, so that's really hard for me. But it's also work to just say, okay, that story is there, that voice is there. I call it the train track in the mind. I grew up in Chicago, and so, there's this L loop. It's called the L downtown. It's just a train that goes around a loop, and I would say that's like what's in my mind, the story, the narrative, the self-hatred, the remembrance, the experience of being hated, how that registered, and just gradually having that edge of silence was so potent. So after about 2 years of being deeply invested in just trying to return to my breath and just being able to say, okay, the story's there, it's back, it's back, it's back, but just to try to recognize it and not get upset about it or get frustrated or even exhausted by it, slowly it could drop. There could be more moments of that inner silence. And during this year of this intensive sitting practice, remember, I committed to what's called a dedicated practice course, where I would sit for 45 minutes every morning. And I remember towards the end of it, it ended in February, so this was something like January. I think it was January of 2008, because I started in January of 2007. I remember being on my cushion that morning, one morning in January of 2008, and just saying, I forgive you. And I don't even know where that came from. Even today, I couldn't tell you. But there was some release that I attribute to that inner silence. It doesn't control me. It doesn't determine my life. It doesn't determine my way of being in the world. Yes, she was harmful. My mother was really harmful, and her parents were really toxic. They really damaged my self-esteem by the way they treated me. And she exposed me to them, and she bought into them. She went to that part. All of this stayed and stayed and stayed. And then there was a moment where it just wasn't so present. And then there were more moments where it just wasn't so present. And then there was this sense of I have some release from this. And that was the beginning of healing. Yeah.
I'm struck by the coincidence of Barack Obama's library space opening in Chicago very recently. And it's been a while. When he was first running for president, I read his book about his experiences. And as I recall, he was biracial Chicago. But his white parents were very supportive of him from what I read. How do you think his experience differs in yours? And is there any chance to have a dialogue about how it hits different kinds of people, different people under different circumstances? Because his experience seems quite different, caused by his grandparents, his mother's kid, being fairly colorblind, frankly. It's as much as anybody can in this society, in this world.
I think Obama, in all honesty, is somewhat nuanced about it in his autobiography. He acknowledges that his grandparents raised him on Hawaii when his mother stayed in Indonesia, that they put him in private school, that they showed him a lot of affection. But he also talks about their racism, and he does acknowledge it. So I don't know if he would use the term colorblind to describe them. He has vignettes in this memoir about his grandmother being worried about taking a bus because she might be attacked by a black man, and how he registered that. Like maybe they didn't see him as black, and how both she was afraid of a caricature of this, the idea that a black man might be violent towards her for no ostensible cause, but also that she didn't really see him. And a big part of coming from the outer periphery of what we call the United States and going to the heart of it, deciding to live in Chicago he's very explicit about this, like learning what it's like to be a black man, because that identity was not associated with him in his home, including his experience of his grandparents. And he's also somewhat nuanced about his grandfather. He's attuned to what, this is my word, not his, but their myopia, and the fact that there are not certain ways of taking on the struggle of the United States, but also acknowledging him in the way that he's embodied and the way that he shows up in the world. So I don't know that Obama would see his experience of his grandparents, even though they were very loving. And you are right, my grandparents were not loving. And actually, one of the experiences I write about in this book that I learned about in therapy just a few years ago with my mother, who was continuing to be very offensive. And so I said, I held her accountable, and she asked if we could go to a therapist, which we did. And I learned this story in one of these sessions, which is that there was a week in which she needed support with my younger brother, and she took him to her parents' home, and they kept him in the house in the backyard for the whole week. They wouldn't let him leave because they didn't want any of the neighbors to see him. So in that way, they were always conscious, and that is a distinction with Obama's grandparents. But I don't think he would let them off so easily in terms of how they internalize these toxic waters we swim in. We all absorb these messages, and his grandparents were not immune to those messages.
So, the non? Okay. I am raising my biracial grandson. I've had him for the last 4 years in my home, and we have put him in private school, and just at the end of the year, the school let him go due to some communication bullying that was occurring with him and 5 other kids at the school. And it's just been so difficult for me to not see where I feel like there was racism in the decision. He did play a part in, his part, and it's just very hard because I have had to look at my own journey in this with him, and there have definitely been times I'm at the other end. I'm like, oh, just do what you need to do, everything's gonna be okay, and I'm here for you, and Frank's here for you, and we just, we've tried to have consequences for, teenagers. I mean, he's 17. And sometimes he acts like he's a 12-year-old in the 17-year-old body. And it's so hard because I want the best for him. And we're in this just place of not being able to we have to make a decision about where he's going to be in school. And the family it's a long story, but anyway, there's a Nazarite religion that he has to follow, and vows were set on him when he was very young. And he has been brainwashed so much by his dad that he's not standing up for himself at all. And you know, I've done what I could back in the past legally, but it didn't do anything. So I don't know. I love Buddhism. I'm a yoga teacher, and I've, you know, surrounded myself with a community in the mountains that has really helped me. I mean, I'm going through every one of these things right now. Everything. And it's just, I want to choose to see clearly.
Well, my husband is here with me. We have a 16-year-old, I would say, who often acts like a 12-year-old. Not to minimize at all the struggle. I mean, even on the way here, we were talking about the fact that our kiddo really needs coaching. Like they're just in, like we're not getting traction. We're not making progress and on certain things, and we've got 2 more years. So I would say I empathize in that way. And the school thing is really hard. We also really empathize with that. I think having balance around it, like not being reactive, is probably the best thing you can do as you're trying to bolster with external supports and recognize that there are many aspects of the situation beyond your control. I just say this from a place of practice and from a place of parenting a child about the same age, and, you know, coming in, being well-resourced, not very financially resourced, but not desperate. And it's still extremely hard. And we're in an era where screens are everything is, like, it seems led with a screen. And it's a very different environment in that way. And kids are, you know, accessing a world in which I think I never could have even anticipated. So it's a struggle, and it changes the way their brains work. And so I think I'll just say, as I work through this as a parent, and I have my own anxieties always, that inner balance, like being able to just communicate and being very consistent about what you aspire to and hope for them, where you see their gifts, how they can develop patterns and practices that serve them, like to come back to that, to make that a part of it, but from this place of deep groundedness, so that you model it and that you're not like freaking out or in a state of devolving. I mean, I say this also like in these very personal ways, just it can be so hard to come up against both your kiddos or your grandchild's inner structure and then an environment that it can be very damaging. But those are huge challenges. And so I think it's always this question of how we meet it, how we can acknowledge our own anxiety, how we can take that on and not project it, not make them responsible for it, to own our own anxiety, to say, this is what I see, this is what I hope for you. And maybe I think this is important for my own kiddo. We've certainly looked for this, but if there's any way to invite role models in, like people you really respect who are Black men or male-bodied, who could serve as also mirrors, I think that's also important. Like for me, I'll just say, even with Buddhism, but this was true earlier, like to see people who were further along, who looked like me and who embodied a way of being that was very compelling, that was really important. Not just the screen, but also other people in our lives where we can look to them and say, I want to be like that. That was really important for me. It's important for our children. Yeah, it's really hard. I don't minimize it at all.
Thank you, Rima, for being here. We actually need to start wrapping it up. Rima's got books in the lobby, and I would say engage her in conversation, but there'll be 22 conversations going on. So thank you for